All right, everyone, we've got to talk about what George Friedman is saying regarding North Korea. Essentially, that the posturing of the United States and, of course, what North Korea has been doing lately points to a likely imminent conflict there, imminent invasion, that is to say, regime change in North Korea. I think Friedman is perhaps more intelligent than most, more keyed into what's happening than most individuals when it comes to such things. He's a former head of Stratfor, which was caught up in some scandalous stuff years ago. I think he was already out by the time that happened, though, if I remember correctly. And Friedman's talked about the idea that the United States has to sort of play off other countries against one another to create balance in order to stymie any upstarts from sort of displacing us, counterbalancing, as he says, China and Japan and so forth. What I would say is that conflict is a lot more likely than it's been in the past. I'm not sure, though, that at this point it's imminent, because there have been situations before throughout the decades, especially in the last decade, where there are considerable standoffs between the U.S. and North Korea, South Korea and North Korea, other states and North Korea. The main change that's happened lately is that China has backed off. That is, you see Russia, I thought it was very, very funny. Some of the people in the corporate media, they looked at the situation, and Russia built a ferry back and forth between Russia and North Korea, and they took it as a token that Putin had taken Kim Jong-un under his wing or something. Oh, well, we can't do anything now. They're obviously in bed with the Russians, another major nuclear power. I'm not so sure about that. I think it's more if China is squeezing North Korea, Russia's going to open its hand a little bit to maybe get some minerals going, get some coal going, whatever they happen to need. Somebody has a tendency to adopt any smaller state that exists in the world. That is, any smaller, less significant state in a military and diplomatic sense tends to be swept up into the general sphere of one of the larger states. And this has been a thing that's gone on throughout most of human history. It's not recent. It's not like, geopolitics of the post-World War I era or something like that. You can look back at we're talking ancient times. Rome has its vassals. The Persian Empire had subjugated states. The Greeks at their height had states that were semi-autonomous but subjugated. You think of Egypt. Alexander marches in. They love him because they think, well, he's liberated us and now he's bowing before our gods. This is great. We're just going to declare him pharaoh. But ultimately, it was semi-autonomous still. It had a totally separate culture and language. They had just a general appreciation for the idea that they've been liberated from the evil Persians or something like that. This has been happening for a very long time. But that being said, North Korea is such a hot potato. It's such a total rogue that it's not, if China's not willing to take you under their wing with their own human rights abuses, their own somewhat lackluster diplomatic standing, because they want to be absolved of that situation, Russia's less likely, I think, than China to deal with such a thing. The Russians will deal with Iran. They'll deal with Syria, some of these authoritarian regimes within Central Asia or within the Arabian Peninsula or the Levant, this general region. But are they willing to deal with North Korea as the total rogue that might drag them into a war on the total other side of their gigantic country, as opposed to Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where they're already sort of entangled anyway? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that war with North Korea is imminent. What I would say is imminent is conflict in general. That doesn't necessarily mean a full-on war or regime change. It could take the form of targeted strikes that destroy their atomic capabilities. And if there is a war, by the way, a sane individual would suggest that the way to go about that is to take out their airfields and their artillery as quickly as possible to decapitate their ability to destroy South Korean lives. Because right now they have primitive atomic weapons. They have to put them on a bomber and drop them on something. But if you deprive them of their air power, they can't really do anything with their bombers. If the runways are completely cratered and debilitated, how are you supposed to get the bomber off the ground? Their atomic weapons are essentially useless. They'd have to put it on a truck, drive it to the DMZ and blow it up there or something like that to even have a halfway decent effect. And I don't think that they would be really willing to do that by the time they mobilized enough organizational capability. to actually do such a thing and drive it into the DMZ and blow it up on a truck, their armed forces would be badly depleted because they would have zero air superiority and they'd be bombed night and day by both South Korea and the United States, probably by Japan, possibly even by China. Russia might get involved. War in North Korea, I think, it properly managed, would be a lot quicker and easier than some people are suggesting, simply because North Korea is so heavily reliant upon outdated artillery and a lot of extra manpower that may or may not even show up to fight. That being said, if we don't have a war with North Korea, bad as this may sound, saying that, we sort of have to beat the drums of war at some point, they will eventually get more atomic weapons, better, possibly fully nuclear systems. We're talking multi-stage. They could figure out how to put it on a missile. And at that point, war becomes inevitable, and the death toll from that war would be catastrophically higher. As of right now, proper targeted strikes before a general invasion to cripple their air power and their artillery would probably save several million lives, as opposed to waiting until they have other systems we'd have to deal with. The possibility that they do launch a nuclear weapon at Tokyo, at Seoul, at Beijing. Can you imagine how many people would die under any of these scenarios? It wouldn't even really matter if you evacuated. It would be a nightmare scenario. It wouldn't lead to war. Even then, it wouldn't lead to World War III. All the other powers of the world would be simultaneously invading North Korea, potentially. But it would still be a nuclear conflict. As of right now, because it's so limited as to their atomic capabilities, we may very well avoid the possibility of atomic reprisal. They've got smaller weapons, older style weapons. They're less sophisticated than the ones most nuclear states use. They've only got a few of them. They have to be dropped by plane. Their air force is largely a joke. What happens if they modernize any of the aspects of this potential atomic ability to make it multi-stage, to put it on a missile, to get some new bomber craft that's actually capable of carrying it reliably and get it actually off of the ground before we are capable of targeting their air bases? Then you have several 100,000 at least additional people dying, even if it's a primitive weapon. Potentially several million people dying if they actually hit a heavily populated urban area. If it was Tokyo, you could end up with 5-10 million people dead. That's a lot of Beijing, same story. Seoul, you'd be approaching that number. Do we really want to wait is my question. Now, war is, in the long term, inevitable on the Korean Peninsula, except with one possibility, and that's that the regime there collapses. But if all the sanctions in the world, plus Chinese large-scale non-involvement in helping them, isn't enough to weaken the regime to get it to go away, you're not going to be able to magically put more pressure on them and cause that to happen. You'll have to do something. At the very least, you have to strike their atomic capabilities. If you conduct those strikes, it is extremely likely that they will say, well, an invasion's imminent, we better start firing that artillery. So what you need to do is, within a very short scope of time, through one means or another, you need to get people on the South Korean side away from the DMZ. You need to give a general order to people in Japan and the rest of South Korea, as well as parts of China, to be wary, because if the sirens start going off, they need to seek shelter. We need a general airstrike on all of their air bases at the same time. We'd have to try to destroy as many of their subs as possible. Thankfully, they're probably following U.S. and Chinese naval groups around, so it should be fairly clear where they are. And if we can accomplish that, and we have the unique capability to do so, we can prevent them from deploying an atomic weapon, destroy the regime, reunify the peninsula, or partially reunify it. At the very least, the Hermit Kingdom goes away and adopts, at worst, a Chinese model, becomes somewhat modernized, has some level of freedom, and is semi-open to the world at large. We at least don't have to worry about atomic weapons being used. Let the Chinese confiscate them. They've already got fully modern nuclear weapons. It's not going to matter if they have 2 or 3 primitive atomic systems from North Korea. It's not a massive expansion of their capabilities. Let them confiscate the weapons. Let them grab up part of the northern province and turn it into a semi-autonomous region, reunify the rest of Korea. A lot of North Koreans have been saved. A lot of South Koreans have been saved. A lot of Japanese and Chinese civilians potentially have been saved. It will be far less lengthy. The death toll will be an order of magnitude less. And so it's not because I'm pro-war that I say this. I look to the suffering of the North Koreans, I pity them, and I say, down the road, if they get multi-stage nuclear weapons and then the regime begins to collapse, it's probably worse, because some rogue general might actually be dumb enough to press the little red button. Something like that could happen. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. We used to be afraid that this could happen with the USSR, with China, or with Pakistan and India, or any of a number of other states. Now we have to worry about North Korea. They're the only true rogue left. Yes, there are problems between Pakistan and India. There are problems still diplomatically between the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and China, Russia and China sometimes. That's definitely true. They used to spar with one another constantly for several decades there. But North Korea is the only one that legitimately is likely to use preemptive atomic strikes against someone if times get tough. How can you avoid that from happening if your response to North Korea's atomic program is to slap more sanctions on them? If they don't work, it doesn't stop them from developing better atomic systems. And if they do work, it potentially collapses the regime and leads to some sort of reprisal anyway. Some sort of fire coming from north of the DMZ with artillery, atomic weapons, whatever it happens to be. It's not warmongering to suggest that war is probably imminent. It's just a matter of when it happens. I don't think that Friedman is necessarily correct in predicting it happens very soon because the posturing's already there. But it is a higher stress scenario. It is more likely than in the past, and has been since China backed off diplomatically and allowed the last round of major sanctions to go forth. When they started to bow before that pressure, when it became clear that China was more worried about expanding into East Africa and doing its string of pearls trade deals, when that became clear, North Korea became far less important, I think, to China. That's about all. Peace out.